recording this conversation. We will make it available for distribution afterwards. So thank you for the reminder to record that. And again, please send me your questions and let's go ahead and get started. Sorry for the little bit of out of order there. So John, I want to start with you because you have said to me that this book, Making a Midwestern Community, is a direct descendant of the work that is being done at the Cleveland Jewish Archives. And we heard in both of your biographies that you've both been extensively involved in that project. I was wondering if you'd take us back to the beginning of that project and tell us what the Cleveland Jewish Archives is all about.
Sure, I'd be delighted to. The Cleveland Jewish Archives really has its roots around 1971, when the Historical Society created a program in collecting documents relating to the diverse immigrant and ethnic history of Cleveland. It was called the Cleveland Regional Ethnic Archives Center at that point. And I began collecting, and I won't tell you what my age is, folks, but at that point I was 5 years old. They hired me young. But that bad joke aside, I began to reach out to a variety of communities, including the Jewish community. And fortunately, one of my connections to the Jewish community was Dr. Lois Scharf, who was at the history department at CWRU. Some of you may know Lois or may have known Lois over the years. And she put me in contact with the National Council of Jewish Women, Cleveland section. And the records came over, and that began to start the ball rolling in collecting documents. And somebody reminded me that there was a person at Federation who needed to be contacted, and that man was Judah Rubenstein. And Judah was the historian for the Federation, had worked on the first history of Cleveland Jews by Lloyd Gartner. He'd been a researcher on that project. We became fast friends, and to go fast forward, Federation became very interested in what was happening at the Historical Society and ethnic collecting, particularly in creating the Jewish Archives. And in 1976, Cleveland Jewish Archives was formally established, and with support from a number of families in the community, that is now a fully endowed project at the Western Reserve Historical Society. Our goal was to collect and preserve documents that related to the Jewish history of Greater Cleveland. And that's a role that Sean is fulfilling now, had a number of curators in the position. But our goal beyond collecting the documents was to make certain that they would be used. And obviously they're used by the community, they're used by students. They've done a number of things. And our dream was to do more books. And unfortunately, Judah was a bookman, and Howard Berger, who was at Federation, was also a bookman. And we began jointly with Federation to publish a number of books relating to Jewish history, including the Gartner book, Emerging Traditions, a book on Camp Wise. And this is a long desiderata, I think, on our part. Not that some of the other books weren't scholarly, but a book on the Jewish community of Cleveland that is done by a major press outside of Cleveland. Kent State did some of the books for us. And that's where this book comes from. It has deep roots. And the delight for some of us who've been associated with this project for a long time is seeing the documents accumulate and be preserved, but then seeing them be interpreted and used by a variety of people, from students to historians in Israel, historians in France, historians in Canada. That's the short story for you, Ben.
Thank you, John. And you alluded to a couple of topics that we're going to unpack a little bit more. So I appreciate the overview. And Sean, I'd like to turn it over to you. You are the curator of the archives today. So tell us about the work that you do as part of this project, and how it led to this book as well.
Sure. So my role really is what we say as the curator for Jewish history. My role is to collect materials from the community related to the topic, to process those materials as an archivist, but then also to do outreach. And outreach is where we get to our involvement with the Maltz Museum. As I think most in the audience know, a good portion of what is on display in the Maltz Museum comes from our collections, And then outreach takes all kinds of forms. Also research and writing, and this book is essentially a form of outreach. I started in the archives in 2005, and I would say that that the idea for a more recent take on local Jewish history was something that really everybody around the archives kind of always had in mind, but we didn't get started on this project until about 7 or 8 years ago. And really it comes from the great cooperation with the Federation. John mentioned Judah Rubinstein at the beginning of the founding of the archives. And really, the archives are founded in cooperation with the Federation. And this project this publication is also a result of that cooperation. It was actually Alan Gross, our liaison to the Federation at that time, who really came to us and said, we need to update the book by Lloyd Gartner, History of the Jews of Cleveland. That was a book that was written in the late 40s, early 50s, not published until the 70s. And it's a terrific book. It just ends really in the mid 20th century. And so here in the 2010s, it was time to do something about that. And that's how this came to be.
Great. Thank you so much. So let's dig in a little bit to Cleveland Jews and the making of a Midwestern community. I was wondering if you could start with, what's in a name, and if you could describe a little bit why you chose the title, what is Midwestern about Cleveland, and more generally, what differentiates Cleveland, Jewish history in Cleveland, from maybe some of the other scholarship in American Jewish history more generally, and give us an overview of just what some of the other things you were trying to accomplish here. I mean, you mentioned extending the story into the 20th century. I mean, that's a big one, but just take us through this book a little bit. John, go ahead.
Well, I think what we had three options in front of us. One was to write sort of a linear addendum to the Gartner book and update everything. The other was to do an entirely new history of the Jews of Cleveland in a linear fashion. But the route that was chosen was to look at a variety of authors looking at particular topics within the community at that point. And I think we were also exploring the fact, this is not the East Coast, this is not the West Coast, this is the Midwest. It's a different Midwest, it's an industrial Midwest. And you could look at Chicago Jews and books on Chicago Jews. So we wanted to see, I think in particular, how the Jewish community worked into the general history of the city, particularly in the years from 1900 on. And that's where Sean's expertise and his knowledge of a variety of authors and experts in Jewish history and various topical subtopics of Jewish history came in. So we went to a multi-authored edited volume.
So that decision to actually make it a volume of different voices, that was a decision that wasn't given at the outset?
No, there was a discussion as to how we would approach renewing Gartner.
And I think really one thing I'd kind of like to point out, because I should have mentioned it earlier, is that I think that in terms of the historiography of Jewish Cleveland, in terms of the books of history that have been written, I think what's impressive is that we have Gartner's history, we have the books that were really Judah's dream, in my understanding, Merging Traditions, which is a photographic essay of Jewish Cleveland, and it's a terrific book. It's a wonderful photo essay with detailed captions and wonderful introductions. It's essentially primary sources, and then we have a few of the kind of smaller titles. The book about Camp Wise, what Clevelanders remember about the shtetl, some really specialized publications. And then we also have the book that was published in 2011, Remembering Cleveland's Jewish Voices, which was edited by Sally Wertheim and Alan Bennett. And that's a collection of sources gathered by Judah, selected by Alan and Sally, that are sources from the archives, again, primary texts. And so we wanted to do something different. And that was an anthology of scholarly essays that would highlight these topics. And I should mention Sally had an involvement in the book, Remembering Cleveland's Jewish Voices, of course. She was the editor of that volume. But then, of course, she was also very influential in the planning stages of this volume, too. So I wanted to mention that as well.
Nice. Thank you. So that's interesting. It's not something I don't know if the three of us had touched on in our planning conversations, but that it's unique in format as well. You're saying there hasn't been a multi-authored approach.
Not on Cleveland, and certainly on other.
Right. Speaking on Cleveland,
when we look at books like this on other Jewish communities in other cities, we see that yes, they are collected volumes of essays, but they're all a little different. Those are mostly actually more kind of coffee table books in lots of ways. We had kind of already done that with merging traditions in some way. So we could say, okay, now is our chance to delve into 20th century Cleveland Jewish history and come up with authors to address various topics.
Nice, thank you. Sorry if this is a curveball. I know we talked about questions at the end, but Gary Moskowitz has a question I'd like to toss to you both. We could spend hours talking about this itself. The question, John, it sounds like you're already seeing it. What is the difference among Eastern, Midwestern, and West Coast? Gary, I'm not sure if you mean Jewish communities or cities in general, but also what makes Cleveland different from other parts of the Midwest. John, I think you mentioned, it's not the agricultural Midwest, it's a different type of Midwest.
And I think we're looking at sort of the regional identities of the United States, South, the Midwest, and West. And the East Coast, of course, is settled first. It's the colonial period. The Midwest begins, at least we're talking about the North, after the Revolutionary War and the settlement of these areas. And the West is beyond the Mississippi, beyond Chicago. But I don't want to be pedantic on that. What I find fascinating about Cleveland is there's an image of the Midwest of being corn and farms and farmers and whatever else. We're the industrial Midwest. And so when we have deep ties to the East Coast, because the New England roots of the city and also a lot of ideas and businesses going back and forth. And we also have ties to a more agricultural area in the rural Midwest in Ohio. My usual line is you can do it geographically. The Allegheny Escarpment ends at the east bank of the Cuyahoga River in the flat Midwest, starts at the west bank. And I don't want to get into the traditional east side versus west side conundrum here. We're an interesting place because culturally we've batted for a long time in terms of museums and so forth with the East Coast. Mm-hmm. And if you're looking at the older families here, there are a lot of Yaleys and Harvards and so forth going back. You see that. So there's a sort of a yin and a yang on this.
That's interesting. Thank you. I something that I learned, and please correct me if I'm mistaken about this, but it's fascinating to see all these squares out in these smaller towns out east of us. Yeah. And one of the reasons I think is that those areas were settled by folks coming from New England who organized their towns around a square, right? Which is a certain type of development that's pretty common here, and I think it is another reinforcement back to that colonial time.
Yeah, and it's that public square that the first Jewish settlers in the 1830s would have seen as the center of the city.
Right. I'm from the West. I grew up in Toledo, so coming to Cleveland, there's that specialness, that uniqueness about Cleveland that I don't see in Toledo necessarily. But anyway, thank you for that question, Gary, and I encourage everybody to submit questions as they come, and we'll try to get to them as they come. Sean, did you have anything to add about Midwesternness or?
Well, so, I think that, one of our, to be perfectly honest, one of the reasons we have Midwestern in the title is because we wanted to attract people who were interested in regional history, and Ohio is a part of the Midwest. I also think, really kind of the relevant point there is that Cleveland develops a bit later as a Jewish community than some of the other communities. So even in Ohio, we have Cincinnati really as a more prominent Jewish community early on. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, if we look at older Jewish communities in the United States, we have communities in smaller towns in the South that are much older, for example, than Cleveland. I think if you think of immigrants' experiences, for example, what Cleveland shares with other Midwestern cities is that we have immigrants coming here after they've landed on the East Coast. Then they come to another, they identify another city as a place to go, and we are the kind of, maybe they're their first destination in the States, but really we're not New York, we're not Philadelphia, we're not Boston, we're not necessarily a larger city, but we did develop a sizable Jewish community.
Very unique place in many, many ways. So question, I guess, back to John. We mentioned already that this book has been published by a major academic press. Can we touch on that briefly, or why that's significant?
Yeah, I think both Sean and I can go back and forth on this. That we've published with Kent State Press, and we've published. The Historical Society has its own imprimatur, and we publish ourselves. But going with Rutgers in particular meant that this was everything that we submitted would be peer reviewed. So this wasn't simply getting the articles in and edited by Sean, who did almost all the editing on this. It was getting them off to the press, and then the press would send them out to scholars in the field, and they would be blind read, and the reviews would come back. And it would take that peer review, a positive peer review, to tell the press that, yes, this is a scholarly book and it's a book worth publishing. That is a major hurdle for getting things like this in print. And I think that's a great deal of pride, because that's a testament to the quality of the archives, the quality of the authors that Sean has identified in this, and the quality of their work.
Excellent.
How do you, Sean?
Oh, and I think it really is a very nice thing, because what it does is it helps us get the book out to the scholarly community, really. And we couldn't have done that really had we just simply published this on our own. With Rutgers University Press as the publisher, what it really means is that scholars of Jewish history who are interested in Cleveland, but who are also interested in the specific topics in the book, are going to find it. And that's really what we wanted.
That's great. So it's a stamp of approval. It's a bigger stage. It's a more rigorous process leading to more rigorous information ultimately, right?
Right. Exactly.
So you've both told me, and it's an academic book. How should amateurs approach this book? Tell us what's in the book.
Well, so we have 10 separate essays, and all, of course, connected to Cleveland, from the history of the Orthodox community until about the 1940s, the Cleveland Jewish philanthropy. I'm thinking of the contents now. Cleveland Jewish philanthropy, Jewish education is covered in an article on the educator Chet Aleph Friedland. We have Harvey Pekar and Superman addressed in a separate article. Articles on suburbanization, the National Council of Jewish Women. John starts us with that in the history of the archives, and we have the National Council of Jewish Women here. So that's a nice thing too. And of course, the other topic to mention is the Soviet Jewish movement here.
And there's a superlative essay on Abba Hillel Silver. It takes a different tack on silver, really.
Can you tell us a little bit about what that different tact is?
Well, it's basically Abba Hillel Silver working with Senator Taft, Robert Taft, and creating support within Congress through Taft for the creation of the State of Israel. And the author is looking at this as sort of the beginning of what would be an ethnic voting bloc, which was a more diverse voting bloc before that time. It's a way the reason this is possible is because Abba Hillel Silver's papers are in the archives at the Historical Society, and that's what makes this possible. And so it's a different, it goes beyond Zionism, it goes beyond the creation of Israel, goes into American politics, and to a man who was one of the prime movers in the Republican Party in Ohio in the 40s and 50s, a prime political name. Very, very interesting article. And in the Cleveland Council of Soviet Anti-Semitism, different article there.
Certainly two. Oh, Sean, go ahead.
Well, so, John mentioned this is possible because we have the Abba Hillel Silver papers that were donated by the temple. It's also really possible too because the microfilm of those papers is available at universities in Israel. Yeah. And the author of that article was Zohar Segev, who accessed the microfilm and has become a scholar of silver in American Jewish history. Actually, I feel like I really should mention the names of the authors. If I can I go through the list of everyone?
I would love it. Please do.
So Ira Robinson, this is the order in which they appear in the book. Ira Robinson, a scholar from Concordia University in Montreal, wrote on the evolution of the Orthodox Jewish community here in Cleveland. David Hammack from Case Western wrote about Jewish philanthropy. Cleveland's own Sylvia Abrams and Lipsa Schachter wrote about Abraham Chaim Friedland and Jewish education. Samantha Baskind in art history at Cleveland State wrote on Harvey Pekar, Everyman versus Superman, comics in Cleveland. Zohar Segev wrote on Abba Hillel Silver. Mary McCune from the State University of New York in Oswego, she wrote on organizational change in the National Council of Jewish Women. Todd Mitchney at Georgia Tech, but also from the area, wrote on Jewish-Black relations in Cleveland from 1920 to 1960. Mark Souther from Cleveland State wrote on Jewish suburbanization. And the title of his paper includes a nice phrase, interesting phrase to talk about, Jewish suburbanization and Jewish presence in the city without Jews. Rachel Gordon from the University of Florida wrote about Suburban Temple after its founding and after 1948. And Shaul Kellner from Vanderbilt wrote on the Soviet Jewish movement here. So that's the list to get everybody's names out there. So.
Thank you. I guess I'll go ahead and mention now that we have Mark Souther and Todd Mitchney in conversation with you, Sean, right here on this stage is what I would say. June 17th. I know some of you are signed up for that. And then on July 1, Sean, you'll be in conversation with Samantha Baskind about, the Todd's and Mark's program is about suburbanization and Jewish presence in a city without Jews and Black Jewish relations. And then on July 1 with Samantha Baskind, a conversation about comics history in Cleveland and about how we love to talk about Superman. We don't always talk about Everyman, Harvey Pekar, in the same way. So quick plug for those of you on the call, please check out our website for information on those programs. And I guess a follow-up question to the list, Sean, and for you, John, as well, is how do you get there? How do you pick? And how do you get to the topics and how do you get to the authors?
Leave that to Sean because his knowledge of who is writing what and what their specialties are in American Jewish history is superb. We knew a few of the local authors, but going beyond that was really Sean.
Well, so we do have, those of you familiar with the community will recognize several names there. But I'm also proud that we have several names that really are kind of new to writing about Jewish Cleveland. And essentially we kind of looked for people who were working on topics that were related to Cleveland already. And they had some connection so that it wasn't necessarily that they were starting a completely brand new research project on a city that they had never been to. So for example, Shaul Kellner, his work as a sociologist is on, he has a new project on the Soviet Jewish movement all over the United States. So when we learned of that, it seemed to make sense to reach out to him to ask if he would take a look at what was happening here in Cleveland. And he wrote a terrific article that he says what really makes the difference is that the movement here, really focused on making relationships between Jews here in Cleveland and Jews in the Soviet Union. There's one name really I should also mention too. We have a terrific introduction to the book by Eli Letterhendler. And he is a professor of Jewish history at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And really, I was thrilled that we got him to write the introduction. He has written about urban Jewish history in the United States, especially in New York. But he's also a specialist in East European Jewish history, in migration. And he was really kind of a perfect person to tie some of these themes together for us.
Thank you. That's excellent. So I want to open it up to both of you as, again, just what surprised you? You know, we talked a lot about the process of making this book, and that's one level, but tell us some history that's contained in here. You've given us a bit about the Soviet Jewry movement and Abba Hillel Silver, which certainly are probably 1 and 2 if you want to talk about Cleveland Jewish history, or maybe top 5, I would say. But tell us some more history. Did anything surprise you? Was there anything you were particularly interested in digging into in this book?
I would, one of the things that and going through when we were both reading the manuscripts together, and it's published now, is Ira Robinson's essay on the Orthodox community in Cleveland, and it's a very full, deep essay, and it has a lot of resonance with me because my doctoral dissertation was on Hiram House when it existed in what was the middle of a largely Orthodox community in Lower Woodland Avenue. So I knew bits and pieces about that community, but Yiddish is not what I do. And Ira was able to go through the Yiddish Welt and other sources and to bring together a history I don't think that is seen in any of the other books on Cleveland Jewish history at this point. So that for me was informative. I don't know if shocking or surprising there. It's just, I'm so glad to be able to access that aspect of this community's history.
And so the chapter, the evolution of the Orthodox community up until 1940.
Yeah.
Right. Can you tell us something about that story?
Well, basically, we're looking at a story of multiple origin points from Eastern Europe, and then the story of accommodating in a community that was not substantially Jewish at that point, and then also trying to preserve orthodoxy when the trends were moving toward reform in other directions. So it's there, but I think a lot of it, if I'm correct, Sean, is about kashrut, isn't it?
It is. That's the most interesting part of it, I think. Really about he asked the question, so what was the meat that you bought in Cleveland really kosher? And the answer is a definitive, maybe. And he goes into the divisions in the community about what was considered kosher and what was not, and the divisions between the rabbis. One other thing to kind of mention about that article is the author, Ira Robinson, is so prolific that he had already published another article on the Jewish community after 1945 that appears elsewhere. It was actually published before we could publish our volume. But so that's great. There's even more out there.
Yeah, that is great. Sean, I'm sorry to be silly about this, but you basically summed up very, very much of Jewish law by saying, maybe. Very few definitive answers and lots of debates about that. And certainly setting up new communities and figuring out how to have a Jewish community of a certain type, or maybe at all, where there wasn't one before. I mean, that's the story that we tell in our gallery. And so I think it's a great connection to the work that you're doing with the book.
Well, I think, Sean can speak to this too. I think about the suburbanization articles and the fact that Sidney Vincent said, city without Jews, but yet you have a cohesive and, the major religious organizations have thrived and stayed together. They've just moved. So it's those articles about suburbanization are not about loss of community, they're about creation, continuity of a community that you can see there.
Mm-hmm. And I think if you ask me what I kind of find most surprising or shocking, I don't know that it's surprising or shocking, but what I really take away from having edited the book is a greater sense of the community as a suburban community. That really does come through. And it really actually comes through in I would say nearly all of the other articles too that might not be focusing on suburbanization, but are dealing with a suburban community. So for example, in the article on the Orthodox, we're also talking about neighborhoods and where the community is located. In philanthropy, we're talking about how the community changes and moves to different neighborhoods. Harvey Pekar is all about Cleveland Heights, right? Mm-hmm. So really all Suburban Temple is about religious reform within Reform Judaism, but the temple is Suburban Temple, right? So really, and we mentioned about the title and talking about Midwestern. If there was another word I could have gotten into the title, it would have been suburban.
Oh boy.
Because I think it is a suburban community and has been for near a good part of the 20th century, a majority of the 20th century, I think I'd say.
I think one of the motifs that comes into that is post-World War II suburbanization. How are Jews going to participate in this new post-World War II America? And how does Jewish identity continue after the war in a new suburban environment, absent those original neighborhoods where the community was generated in cities like Cleveland? And I think the Suburban Temple article gets into that. The Council of Jewish Women article gets into that as well. So
yeah,
it sounds like an academic book, but it's a really good read. It is an academic book, and it's a great read.
Well, you're sort of bringing up the idea of acceptance and assimilation of the Jewish community over time and how that has changed and evolved, right? I mean, the process of moving out of the old neighborhood and into the suburbs where you get the front lawn and the same house as everybody else. And that process wasn't so unique to Cleveland. I mean, the patterns of development across this country brought Jews out of the cities into the suburbs all over the country, right?
Well, that's, I think, what Rachel Gordon compares Cleveland with Illinois. It's Park Forest, if I'm not mistaken, if I've had that remembered.
Yes.
So she's doing a one-on-one comparison of what's happening in suburbanization with Cleveland Jews with those in Illinois, and that adds a little more depth to that chapter. But yeah, it's a different time. It's a time of redefinition, continuities. What do you keep, so forth. It's a Jewish question, but it's also, I would say, my perspective, a general ethnic question after World War II, when Poles or Italians or so forth move out of those home communities and become suburbanized. What happens? How do you become American? What is American?
This is a very prescient question, John, that would take hours to answer. So, and I think it sounds like we're getting to, you cover it in many different angles in the book, right? So, an obvious question that was asked to me privately is how to buy this book. And I'm gonna chat to everybody the link to the book on Rutgers University Press's website that has all the information you need about the book. You can certainly purchase it from there. You can also purchase it from the museum store, the Maltz Museum store. Nobody's there right now, so send me an email if you're interested in that. And we'd also encourage you to look to your favorite local independent bookstore or wherever you purchase your books. So, Sean, I think you maybe were about to answer a question about.
Well, so I saw there was a question in the chat about the Jewish orphan home.
Yeah.
So the question was it purposeful that it was founded in Cleveland because of geography? So it's founded in 1868. It is founded by B'nai B'rith, and this is really a regional organization. And the Jewish Orphan Home is, well, I guess at that time it really is the Jewish Orphan Asylum, is founded as a regional institution, a Midwestern institution in Cleveland. And so the children there in 1868 are children from really throughout the Midwest, and that means it means Ohio, but it also means Nebraska and Minnesota, South Dakota. It really does mean the entire region. of course, we know that institution today as Belfair.
Right, and I just want to mention, Sean, that we did a summer of programming in partnership with Belfair as they celebrated their 150th year. And Sean did a gallery talk on Belfair where we gathered what we intend to be a smaller group of participants in a little corner of the gallery, and we had so many people sign up for this talk that we had to actually move it in the theater. We walked by the little area where we talk about Belfair in the museum, but you gave the talk in our theater, and folks stuck around for hours just sharing their experiences with you and their histories of being at that organization. It's pretty an amazing institution. So
it is definitely.
And I guess I'm sorry if you answered this just now, but do you talk a lot about Belfair in the book?
So Belfair is certainly mentioned in the article on Jewish philanthropy. I have a special interest in the history of Jewish orphans, and so actually I'm planning another article on Belfair to address that. Gary Polster has a book, Inside Looking Out, which is all about the history of the Jewish orphan asylum to the 1920s. I think there's more to be written on the later period when it becomes Belfair and transitions to a more general, not an orphanage, but transitions more to a more general children's services organization.
Right, and that transition, Belfair didn't invent that, right? The whole conception,
right, exactly.
For children.
Exactly.
That was essentially the subject of the talk, right?
Right.
So, yeah. John, did you have anything you wanted to add on that?
Not about Belfair. I was just thinking about David Hammack's essay on Jewish philanthropy, because I saw a question coming up on Jewish philanthropy, and there are two things. One, that he talks about the extraordinary movement from working within the community to reaching outside of the community, being a broader community-based philanthropy, and we all know that today it's part of the general Cleveland philanthropy scene. It's just very, very wide. The other thing I like, going back to Ellie Letterhandler's forward, is he acknowledges that Cleveland's an important city to study in American urban Jewish history. He doesn't say it in that way, but his comments basically, I think, reify what our hopes were in getting the archives funded and having a book like this, that a major scholar in the field would come to a conclusion that this is an important book about an important city.
Thank you. That's great. We've got a lot of comments in the chat, so I want to, forgive me, folks. I'm doing a lot of things at once. I want to go through some of these comments. We've got Diane Siegel, who I think she's joined by her 92-year-old mother, and thank you both for being here. And she's mentioning. She brought up, I think what you're getting at, Diane, is deed restrictions and the ability or inability of Jews to move into certain neighborhoods. And certainly we're going to talk about this on our June 17th program, but I want to ask the question to you both. Or I guess acknowledge Diane's comments. They were limited, her parents were limited to where, or Jews were limited to where they could or could not move. And a related question that came in, I guess, on a general level, where does anti-Semitism come into play in any of these topics? Could you talk about that? And certainly, I would call deed restrictions a form of structural anti-Semitism, of course. So, how about that question?
So that's certainly part of the topic of Mark Souther's research and suburbanization. The deed restrictions that were in Shaker Heights, and even the movement into Beechwood, and the fight to establish the building of Fairmount Temple, which took so long and went to the Ohio State Supreme Court. So those are examples of real anti-Semitism. So that's certainly true. When we look at, kind of when I talk about the 20th century as a period of suburbanization for the Cleveland Jewish community, and that really, though, that is starting really in the 1910s, at least, maybe even earlier, in terms of movement into Cleveland Heights. And so, that really is pretty early. So so yes, it is a question of which suburbs they go to and when they go to those suburbs. That's an important part of the history.
We don't have this. I think Mark touches upon it, but Cleveland Heights is very interesting because I've always, I live in Cleveland Heights, but my streets are named Berkshire, Hampshire, Corydon. They're all Anglophilic, and that's Cleveland Heights is being set up. And the fact that by the 1920s it has become substantially Jewish is an incredible story, and I think that needs a little bit further digging as to how that happened. In what was to be. Shaker Heights, though, starts out with restrictive covenants, and those spread out to Pepper Pike and to Beechwood and so forth. So that's one of the issues that that's touched upon. The Souther chapter is really good on this.
Yeah, and I guess I kind of want to cut it off there because I would love to encourage everybody to come back for that conversation with Mark Souther and Todd Mishney in 2 weeks. There's a quick question. Do either of you know the title of a book about the Jewish orphan home from one of their first directors? Was that the book you mentioned, Sean, earlier?
No, actually, that's the book I mentioned was Inside Looking Out by Gary Polster, who was a professor at Ursuline.
Okay.
The book that is being asked about here is, I believe the title is As I Saw It, and it's by Michael Charlotte, who was I believe he was the director after Wolfenstein.
Could you say the title again?
As I Saw It by Michael Charlotte. I can type that into the chat.
Very good. I just trying to find any information on Google. I don't know if it's widely available or anything, but
we certainly have it at the Historical Society. It should be in the local public libraries once they reopen. Could I address the other question in the chat too? So there's a question about where the first temples were established.
Yeah, go ahead.
The suburbs. Some of that is certainly addressed in Ira Robinson's article on the Orthodox Jewish community. I should also, though, direct you to Jeff Morris's book and web project, Haymarket to the Heights. It's available online very easily. And
what's that called?
Haymarket to the Heights.
Oh, right. And John, did you have something to add there?
No, it's good. That is just an incredible story. What I call the migrations, the congregations.
What he really has done is kind of to trace the evolution of the buildings and when they move from one building to another.
And it's one of my favorite parts of the museum is the map on the wall where you push the button and the little lights light up by era, and that's a very easy to comprehend visual understanding of where the congregations went. And is it fair to say the organizations follow the people, or vice versa?
No, certainly, yeah, no, of course. As the as people are migrating further east, the institutions have to move too. And so again, we'll say more about this in the program on the 17th. But what is also interesting is that suburbanization is actually pretty rapid.
Yeah. So another question from John Ryan. Thank you for being here, John. He asks about Jewish involvement in the labor movement here in Cleveland. Is that addressed in the book, or could you say anything about that?
Robinson touches upon it, I think, with the kashrut laws a bit, but I don't.
And it's mentioned certainly as a part of Abba Hillel Silver's work. Abba Hillel Silver was involved in the labor movement in the 1930s. It was one of his causes. It's not addressed really as a separate issue. The closest that I've gotten to that because of the topic really was my previous book on Cleveland Jewish history, A Stitch in Time, about the Cleveland garment industry. And so that, of course, deals with the labor movement. But it's not, to be fair, it's not so much in this volume.
In this one, but John, thank you again for your question. I would suggest you check out Sean's previous work for some more info on that. And the chapter, John, you mentioned was Ira Robinson's about the evolution of Jewish Orthodoxy, right?
Yeah, it touches upon it. The main theme is elsewhere, but it gets into workers there.
Sure. So it sounds like, John, to answer your question, not a discrete focus, but certainly shows up in a number of ways. Thank you all so much for your questions. I'm scrolling through to Make sure I'm getting
Wow.
everything.
I know them.
And a comment again from Gary: deed restrictions certainly not unique to Cleveland. Absolutely not. That's a sad reality of the country that we live in, and interesting and difficult conversation about how that aspect of 20th century life is influencing our world today. And I think that's unfortunately a topic for another program, which I would love to plan, so stay tuned. Any other comments from Sean or John about any of the questions? Again, I just want to make sure I'm getting to everybody. Len Gold, thank you, Len. I did see this, a tour of Jewish Cleveland with Nate Arnold. Be very meaningful along with reading this book, and so that is certainly true. I would wager a guess that many of the folks on this call have taken that tour. I hope one day we can do that.
It certainly would accompany the book well. There's still really a lot to see in the older neighborhoods of Glenville and Kinsman. And so hopefully we'll get to the point where we can do that in real life again.
That's right. So seems like a relatively hopeful note to end on. I want to just open it up to the audience one more time if there are any questions. I'm seeing none and hearing none. I think we'll wrap up. Do either of you have any closing remarks you want to add?
Well, I could be bold and say buy the book. But
please, I'm leaving it wide open. Buy the book.
But I think from personal, I think an institutional perspective, the Historical Society is honored to be part of this book. And I think the faith that the Jewish community has placed in the Historical Society as an archive for its records, amazing thing. And I'm delighted that we've been working together for so long. And it's, this is not a capstone. I don't want to put a capstone on anything for my career or anything else, but it's just where we wanted this body of material to go, and that is to feed our knowledge critically about a major community, a major population within Northeastern Ohio.
Well, thank you for saying that, John. Sorry to cut you off, and thank you so much. Sean, before you tie us up, we did have one more question came in, and it's an interesting one. Are you familiar with the Jewish camping club called the Hobos? I am not. Have you heard of that?
I have heard something about that, but I don't know so much about it. To be perfectly honest, I don't. I guess, but I look forward to learning more. If somebody has materials about that or memories related to that.
Julio, please email Sean S. Martin at wrhs.org to let him in on your secret club. And I guess my final question to you both is, what's next for the archives? What's the next book?
I don't know.
That's a good question. So I can't say that we have another book planned. I am working on some other research, and there are some other topics certainly to be addressed. I said in a very short afterword to the book that there are some other topics to be addressed. We could write more on the Orthodox community, on Jewish education, on questions of internal migration, about Glenville and Kinsman and movement to the suburbs. We could write about comparisons of the Jewish community to other ethnic groups here in the Cleveland area. We could do more on Black Jewish relations, the fascinating history of Karamu, for example, and Dorothy and Reuben Silver. I have some other research of my own that I'm working on, which relates to none of those topics, but is on Die Jiddische Welt, the Yiddish newspaper here in Cleveland, and on the Jewish connection to the cultural gardens. And also I've got something I'm working on Belfair, as I mentioned. So there's still many, many topics that could be addressed. I see a comment from Michael Barron about political Cleveland. That's certainly a topic that could be addressed too. One thing I should also actually say that, just kind of a couple of things for people who are interested. So you asked what really is next for the archives. I think really my next projects focus much more on the archival side of things in terms of digitization. And getting materials out there online. We're seeing really, especially the need for that now during this pandemic, right? When we were all forced to be at home. So the more we can do on that in the future, the better. Until then, of course, you can use our catalog at the Historical Society to see the collections that we have. Our digital repository, Digital Cleveland Starts Here, has all kinds of photographs related to the Jewish community from our Cleveland picture file. And I should also mention actually the website of Arnie Berger, clevelandjewishhistory.net, which includes all kinds of resources on all kinds of topics, many of which we've talked about and many of which we haven't. So that's something to check out as well.
And I just a shout out to Arnie. I know he registered. I'm not sure if he joined us, but shout out to Arnie Berger. And all the other Cleveland historians and history makers on the call, like I said at the top. So thank you both. Great discussion. Buy the book. You can find it, like I said, at Rutgers. I sent the link in the chat. Or call us at the museum. I want to clarify. You can call the museum. We'll have some kind of way to get in touch with us on our cell phones. We're all working from home these days. Or you can email me and we'll help you get the book through the museum. We are open. We're all well, the office is open. We're all working from home, but no, the museum is currently closed. So hopefully we'll reopen soon. John Grabowski, thank you so much. Sean Martin, great discussion. And thank you all so much for joining us and for your questions. And have a great night.
Thanks, Ben.
Bye,
Be well, everyone.